The judge was still talking when people realized the numbers were not stopping. Life sentence after life sentence stacking until the room felt heavier than it already was. 9 life sentences landed on Craig Petties, even though whispers said he had talked, even though sealed files stayed sealed, even though his freedom disappeared long before that day. Families sat stiff, prosecutors watched quietly, and nobody explained how cartel connections and ordered killings still ended this way. The math did not line up, which made people lean forward instead of relax, since this punishment only makes sense once you trace the road backward. Before the money, before Mexico, before courtrooms and armored transport vans, Craig Petties came up in Riverside, a South Memphis pocket shaped by routine struggle rather than constant chaos. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Riverside sat close enough to downtown to feel city pressure, while staying boxed in by limited jobs, crowded schools, and open-air drug traffic that never hid itself. This was not a place defined by nonstop violence, yet survival lessons showed up early through observation, repetition, and quiet adjustment to surroundings that rewarded hustle more than patience. Kids learned fast which blocks stayed active, which houses moved weight, and which corners paid attention to strangers, turning awareness into an everyday skill rather than a dramatic awakening. Craig Petties grew up inside a small brick house on West Dyson Avenue, raised by his mother, Evergene Petties, who worked steadily but never caught up financially. His father stayed absent, which was common enough locally that it barely registered as unusual, yet it shifted responsibility early toward independence and self-reliance. Evergene kept the house grounded, working school jobs and foster care to keep food stable, though the income barely cleared the survival level. That balance created pressure without chaos, where needs were met, but extras never came easy, shaping how Craig evaluated opportunity long before he understood risk. By his early teens, Craig already blended into neighborhood patterns without standing out as reckless or loud, which helped him move unnoticed while learning street economics. At 15, his first arrest came after a sawed-off shotgun discharge inside the house, an incident that reflected access rather than intent, since guns circulated freely through friends and relatives. The arrest did not shock anyone around him, since juvenile contact with law enforcement felt routine instead of defining, almost like paperwork attached to growing up there. That same normalcy kept consequences from feeling permanent, allowing missteps to register as lessons instead of warnings. School gradually faded from Craig's daily focus, not through rebellion, but through quiet disengagement shaped by relevance rather than defiance. Carver High School lost priority as street presence gained value, since money and recognition traveled faster outside classrooms than inside them. Selling crack at 16 placed Craig among many peers doing similar work, which softened the stigma and replaced fear with familiarity. When he faced attempted murder charges in December 1993, after a shooting involving Eric Cole, the case blended into the background noise of the neighborhood instead of resetting his path entirely. Court evaluations described Craig as small-framed, impulsive, and resentful of authority, yet polite and controlled, which matched how people remembered him on the block. The juvenile system processed him without ceremony, sending the message that recovery mattered more than punishment at that stage. That outcome reinforced a belief common among local teens that consequences appeared flexible if you stayed young enough and avoided headlines. Those early outcomes shaped confidence quietly, not as arrogance, but as reassurance that survival included margins for error. The nickname Lil C stuck around this time, not as branding or reputation building, but as simple identification tied to size and familiarity. Nobody treated it as a symbol, since nicknames functioned like placeholders until behavior gave them meaning later. Craig stayed observant, learning movement patterns, supplier habits, and cash flow rhythms without rushing visibility. That restraint separated him from louder peers who chased attention early and drew enforcement pressure faster. Proximity to the drug trade normalized scale for Craig long before profit entered his own hands, since he watched older dealers operate beyond street-level exchanges. Conversations around stash houses, vehicle swaps, and bulk movement happened openly enough to feel instructional rather than secretive. Seeing that volume existed beyond hand-to-hand sales reshaped his idea of what success could look like. That understanding did not push him immediately, yet it planted expectations that small wins were temporary steps toward larger operations waiting nearby. By 1995, Craig Petties was already moving with intent, though nothing about his name rang loud enough to echo past South Memphis yet. That year shifted everything, not through violence or luck alone, but through access, timing, and a decision most people around him would have mishandled. The moment came when a major local supplier got locked up, leaving unfinished business sitting quietly inside police custody. What mattered was not the arrest itself, but what the arrested man knew, which was that his Chevy Lumina held something far more valuable than the vehicle. The car landed inside an impound lot after the arrest, still carrying roughly $500,000 hidden inside a custom compartment. From jail, the supplier reached out to Antonio Allen, Craig's older cousin, trusting blood ties and shared history to solve the problem quickly. Antonio wanted the money retrieved before police inventory caught up, yet his size worked against him in a practical way. He needed someone smaller, quicker, and calm under pressure, which naturally pointed toward Craig without any dramatic conversation. That night, Craig hopped the fence, slipped into the Lumina, located the compartment, and walked out carrying bags of cash without drawing attention. The move worked clean, not through bravado, but through preparation and restraint, which matched how Craig handled most situations. Once the money surfaced, expectations formed immediately, since the jailed supplier assumed the cash would return to him. Instead, Craig and his circle kept it, marking the first serious break from playing roles assigned by older figures. Antonio Allen received his portion, though Craig quietly walked away with about $50,000, which already exceeded anything he had touched before. That split mattered less than the mindset shift that followed, since Craig treated the money as leverage rather than a celebration. Some people around him upgraded cars, clothes, and visibility, while Craig paused long enough to consider how quickly money disappeared when it lacked structure. That pause separated him from peers who treated windfalls as finish lines instead of openings. Craig did spend selectively, buying a Cadillac and helping his mother handle long-delayed household issues, which kept appearances balanced without drawing excess curiosity. After that, most of the cash went directly back into narcotics purchases, increasing both quantity and consistency. Instead of chasing fast flips, he focused on repeat cycles that widened margins gradually. That discipline allowed him to scale quietly, avoiding the noise that usually followed sudden wealth in Memphis neighborhoods. What changed during this period was Craig's position inside transactions, shifting from participant to coordinator without announcing himself. He began sourcing larger quantities, delegating smaller sales, and tracking movement rather than standing inside it. Conversations moved from street corners to cars, then to houses, where decisions carry broader consequences. The work stopped feeling like hustling and started resembling operations, even though nobody used that word yet. This approach reshaped how people interacted with him, since Craig stopped asking questions and started answering them instead. Suppliers respected his consistency, while sellers depended on his reliability, creating a web of quiet obligation. Even law enforcement attention stayed minimal during this phase, since nothing about Craig looked chaotic or reckless. He stayed young, composed, and local enough to blend in, which kept suspicion scattered rather than focused. Volume became the new language during this stretch, replacing street-level thinking with wholesale logic that Craig absorbed naturally. Watching older dealers had already taught him that real power lived upstream, where supply determined survival. The $500,000 moment accelerated that lesson, showing him how capital multiplied influence faster than reputation ever could. From that point forward, Craig evaluated moves by scale, asking how far something reached rather than how loud it landed. That mindset did not announce itself publicly, yet it guided every decision that followed, shaping the next decade before anyone realized it. The impound lot theft looked small from the outside, almost forgettable compared to later headlines. Inside Craig's thinking, however, it marked the first time opportunity met preparation without hesitation. Once that connection was locked in, the road ahead stopped being about corners entirely. After the impound lot money settled into circulation, Craig Petties stopped treating street sales as the center of gravity, since repetition exposed limits faster than profit revealed upside. He no longer needed to touch the product daily to understand flow, which freed his attention towards sourcing, timing, and reliability across multiple hands. That adjustment reduced risk exposure while increasing influence, since distance insulated him from random disruptions that swallowed less organized crews. What looked like stepping back actually functioned as stepping up, since decisions now shaped outcomes for others instead of just himself. During this transition, Craig leaned into structure rather than expansion noise, using houses, vehicles, and paperwork to mask movement without advertising intent. Stash locations rotated quietly through South Memphis and nearby suburbs, staying low profile while maintaining access routes that stayed predictable only to insiders. Front operations began appearing on paper, including auto-related businesses and small logistics filings that suggested legitimacy without drawing attention. Those layers allowed movement to appear ordinary, blending commerce with routine traffic patterns instead of standing out through flash. Trucking paperwork became especially useful, offering flexibility without commitment to actual fleet ownership. Filing forms under business names created justification for movement while keeping overhead minimal, which fit Craig's preference for adaptability over fixed assets. Vehicles moved products between houses and cities under the appearance of work rather than urgency. That cover mattered since law enforcement attention often followed chaos, not routine, allowing Craig's organization to mature quietly. Memphis itself played a central role during this period, functioning less like a hometown and more like a distribution hinge. The city's interstate access connected east, west, north, and south, making it ideal for rerouting without excessive travel time. I-40 and I-55 carried steady traffic that concealed movement within volume, while regional hubs stayed close enough to manage personally. Craig recognized early that geography offered leverage, since Memphis allowed supply to reach multiple markets without centralized exposure. Expansion followed patterns rather than ambition, reaching into Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia through trusted intermediaries. Craig avoided random partnerships, preferring people tied by history or reliability instead of hype. Each extension came with redundancy, ensuring one disruption did not stall everything else. That patience slowed headlines but strengthened infrastructure, keeping operations resilient under pressure. During this phase, Craig's role inside the gangster disciples evolved naturally, framed by usefulness rather than symbolism. He did not posture ideology or slogans, focusing instead on consistency, access, and problem resolution. That approach earned quiet respect since results carried weight without requiring speeches or threats. People understood that Craig solved supply issues, which mattered more than affiliation rhetoric during money conversations. Law enforcement awareness began forming subtly, marked by increased surveillance chatter rather than direct intervention. Officers noticed patterns connecting seizures across counties, yet evidence lacked cohesion without centralized arrests. Craig's insulation strategy complicated attribution, since he rarely appeared during transactions. That absence delayed clarity, forcing investigators to map networks instead of catching individuals. Meanwhile, Craig refined communication methods, limiting direct contact and delegating through layers that reduced exposure. Instructions passed through trusted voices, maintaining alignment without unnecessary meetings. That discipline contrasted sharply with crews who gathered openly, mistaking visibility for strength. Craig's organization stayed quieter, which preserved longevity while competitors burned out. Money flow increased steadily, though lifestyle remained controlled enough to avoid early suspicion spikes. Craig reinvested gains into scale rather than spectacle, reinforcing the cycle that kept growth stable. That restraint reinforced trust among partners, who valued predictability over excitement. Each successful delivery strengthened the reputation without requiring public acknowledgement. By the late 1990s, Craig no longer operated as a local dealer, even though his roots stayed visible. He functioned as a distributor coordinating movement across state lines, managing risk through structure rather than intimidation. That position changed how others approached him, seeking supply instead of offering opportunities. The shift happened quietly, yet it set the stage for everything that followed, since Craig now controlled pathways instead of endpoints. By the late 1990s, Craig Petties no longer blended into South Memphis the way he once did, since money changes posture before it changes addresses. The move into Hickory Hill marked that shift clearly, placing him inside a middle-class neighborhood where lawns stayed cut and traffic slowed after dark. The house itself did not scream excess from the outside, yet inside it reflected a different level of comfort than most local hustlers ever reached. That contrast created quiet curiosity, since people noticed when someone arrived without clocking out anywhere. Vehicles amplified that visibility, especially the Bentleys, Mercedes, and customized rides that cycled through his driveway without explanation. Petties did not parade them down the block daily, yet their presence carried weight simply by existing. Cars like that changed how people spoke around him, lowering voices and adjusting tone, which subtly expanded his authority without confrontation. Wealth rewired perception, turning Craig from a familiar face into a figure people evaluated more carefully. Inside the house, cash handling became routine rather than celebratory, with stacks counted on a pool table during slow afternoons. That detail mattered since it normalized volume within domestic space, blurring lines between home and operation. Counting money stopped feeling dramatic once repetition set in, turning million-dollar tallies into administrative tasks. That normalization insulated Craig emotionally, keeping decisions steady instead of reactive. As money grew, Craig increased distance from street-level risk, replacing proximity with delegation and scheduling. He rarely needed to be present during exchanges, relying on trusted handlers to manage delivery points. That separation reduced exposure to random stops, robberies, or impulsive violence that swallowed smaller crews. Distance became a form of protection, allowing Craig to stay informed without staying vulnerable. Law enforcement attention followed slowly, building through pattern recognition rather than direct confrontation. Investigators noticed correlations between seizures across counties, vehicle registrations tied to shell businesses, and properties changing hands without obvious income sources. None of it justified immediate action, yet together it formed a picture that stayed unfinished for years. That slow accumulation frustrated officers, though it also kept Craig unaware of how closely he was being mapped. Craig's lifestyle also signaled that local supply limits approached faster than expected, since volume demanded consistency beyond regional reach. Deals grew larger, margins tightened, and reliability mattered more than loyalty. That reality nudged Craig toward thinking beyond Memphis even before new connections surfaced. The city remained central, yet its role shifted from endpoint to passageway. People around him sensed the change, noticing how conversations shifted from street politics toward logistics and timing. Craig spoke less about neighborhoods and more about routes, schedules, and quantities. That language change separated him from peers still anchored in territorial disputes. Money had lifted him into a different conversation entirely. Despite increased visibility, Craig avoided recklessness, balancing comfort with restraint that kept law enforcement guessing. He did not flood social circles with excess or broadcast success through noise. That moderation delayed intervention, allowing operations to mature while attention stayed diffuse. Underneath the lifestyle, however, pressure built steadily, since growth always invites scrutiny. By the end of this phase, Craig Petties stood at a threshold, carrying wealth that outpaced local ecosystems. Hickory Hill represented a rival, yet also signaled the need for something bigger. The money already outgrew Memphis, even if Craig himself had not fully acknowledged it yet. By the early 2000s, Craig Petties had reached a ceiling that Memphis alone could not raise any higher, since consistency at scale demanded sources beyond regional reach. Supply conversations started circling the same names repeatedly, with prices tightening and reliability fluctuating whenever intermediaries got nervous or greedy. Craig noticed those pressure points through missed deliveries, delayed shipments, and margins shrinking in ways that paperwork alone could not solve. That friction pushed him toward introductions framed as business necessities rather than ambitions, keeping emotion out of decisions that needed precision. Edgar Valdez Villarreal entered Craig's orbit through that practical lens, not through legend, reputation, or cartel mythology circulating on the streets. Valdez, born in Texas and operating between borders, functioned as a broker with access rather than a figure chasing the spotlight. He understood pricing, movement, and enforcement, speaking the language of volume rather than territory. That alignment mattered, since Craig responded to structure more than flash during negotiations that carried long-term consequences. Their first meetings happened in Texas, chosen for convenience rather than symbolism, since routes already passed through those corridors. Conversations stayed focused on quantities, payment timing, and expectations around discretion. Neither side rushed familiarity, keeping exchanges transactional while evaluating reliability. Trust was built slowly through delivery accuracy and response time, not through promises or shared backgrounds. Craig's value became clear quickly, since he controlled distribution pathways that moved product efficiently across multiple states. Memphis sat at the center of those routes, allowing loads to break down and reassemble without drawing attention. Craig's organization already handled movement cleanly, which reduced risk for upstream suppliers. That efficiency mattered more than volume alone, since reliability protected everyone involved. Pricing advantages followed naturally once consistency proved itself, lowering costs compared to domestic middlemen who inflated margins. Those savings translated into competitive leverage across Craig's network, strengthening his position quietly. He reinvested those gains into expanding capacity rather than personal indulgence, reinforcing confidence from his new partners. Each completed cycle tightened trust without needing reinforcement through conversation. Weapons entered the picture as functional currency, since suppliers valued access to American firearms that moved south efficiently. Craig's side facilitated acquisition and transfer through existing channels, keeping transactions discreet and controlled. That service deepened mutual dependence, transforming a buyer relationship into a partnership built on exchange. Each successful transfer reinforced confidence that Craig understood obligations beyond profit. The racial and cultural rarity of this partnership never required acknowledgement during negotiations, though everyone understood its implications. Craig did not attempt to fit into cartel culture, focusing instead on performance and discretion. Valdez evaluated output rather than background, measuring worth through execution rather than origin. That mutual pragmatism bypassed barriers that usually blocked similar relationships. Trust developed without ceremony, strengthened by Craig's ability to solve problems before they escalated. When shipments needed rerouting, Craig adjusted without panic, preserving schedules despite pressure. That calm response signaled competence under stress, a trait suppliers valued heavily. Reliability under friction built credibility faster than any shared history ever could. As the partnership solidified, Craig gained access to quantities previously unavailable through domestic channels. Loads increased without drama, allowing distribution to scale without sudden spikes that attract attention. That control reshaped his organization, shifting focus toward coordination rather than acquisition. The ceiling lifted quietly, expanding possibilities without announcing itself publicly. Craig remained careful not to broadcast this shift internally, limiting knowledge to a small circle. Compartmentalization protected operations, ensuring no single disruption exposed the entire structure. That discipline mirrored cartel expectations, reinforcing trust through alignment rather than words. Each side recognized the value of silence during expansion. This relationship altered Craig's posture permanently, though he maintained outward restraint. He understood that access to upstream supply changed every downstream calculation. Decisions now carried international implications, even when executed locally. That awareness sharpened focus, pushing Craig toward caution rather than aggression. The move also increased stakes, since the partnership required adherence to stricter expectations around security and loyalty. Mistakes that once caused inconvenience now carry heavier consequences. Craig adjusted by tightening oversight and reducing exposure points. That refinement strengthened the organization while raising internal pressure. Law enforcement awareness intensified indirectly during this period, sensing increased volume without identifying the source transitions. Investigators noticed consistency improving rather than breaking, which suggested upstream changes. Without names or proof, suspicion stayed abstract, allowing Craig time to entrench systems. That delay proved critical for establishing long-term pathways. Within his network, Craig's authority solidified through results rather than declarations. Partners noticed smoother operations, fewer shortages, and steadier income. Those improvements reinforced loyalty through benefit rather than fear. Performance replaced persuasion as the primary motivator. Valdez and his associates evaluated Craig through similar metrics, tracking delivery completion and discretion. Each successful exchange reinforced the belief that this partnership worked. Cultural differences faded beneath operational alignment, reducing friction naturally. Business efficiency erased boundaries that ideology could not. The implications extended beyond profit, reshaping Craig's risk landscape entirely. He now navigated relationships with organizations that enforced accountability through decisive action. That reality required recalibration, emphasizing foresight over reaction. Craig adapted quickly, understanding that survival depended on anticipation. This partnership also reframed Craig's identity within his own organization. He shifted from regional distributor to international conduit without announcing the title. That quiet elevation insulated him from unnecessary exposure. Influence expanded while visibility stayed controlled. As operations matured, Craig began viewing challenges through broader lenses, considering border dynamics and currency flow. That perspective changed how he evaluated threats and opportunities. Local conflicts lost priority compared to maintaining supply integrity. Strategic focus replaced territorial concern. The cartel door opening did not feel dramatic in real time, since change unfolded through routine adjustments. Each step seemed incremental, yet the cumulative impact proved massive. Craig recognized the shift only after stability set in. By then, retreat no longer made sense. This new ceiling altered Craig's future irreversibly, binding his trajectory to forces beyond Memphis. The partnership demanded precision, discretion, and discipline at every level. Craig embraced those demands, knowing access like this rarely appeared twice. Once crossed, the threshold stayed behind him permanently. The shift started quietly when power rearranged itself inside Mexico, since alliances that once held steady began cracking under pressure from money and mistrust. The Beltran-Leiva brothers split from Joaquin Guzman's orbit, choosing survival through alignment with Los Zetas instead of loyalty to old structures. That realignment mattered far beyond border towns, since distribution chains rely on stability more than reputation. Once those relationships fractured, every partner upstream felt the tremor, whether they wanted it or not. For Craig Petties, those tremors reached Memphis through timing changes, new security expectations, and stricter demands around discretion. Suppliers adjusted routes, escorts increased, and communication protocols tightened without explanation. Those shifts signaled conflict without requiring briefings, since patterns speak louder than announcements in this line of work. Craig understood that violence down south would never stay local, since logistics do not respect borders. Cartel realignments ripple north through pressure rather than spectacle, changing how loads move and who enforces consequences. When Los Zetas entered the picture, enforcement became sharper and less forgiving, prioritizing control over negotiation. That style filtered into expectations placed on partners like Craig, demanding tighter discipline across networks. Reliability turned from an advantage into a requirement almost overnight. Craig's operation became indirectly tied to cartel violence dynamics through dependency rather than intent. He did not need to participate in shootings to feel their impact, since disruptions affected pricing, scheduling, and trust. Every delay raised suspicion, and every mistake risked escalation beyond local consequences. That environment demanded heightened vigilance across Memphis operations. Paranoia increased steadily, though it presented as caution rather than panic. Craig limited information flow further, shrinking the circle of full operations. Meetings moved locations more often, schedules varied intentionally, and contingency plans grew thicker. Those adjustments reflected awareness that the stakes changed without warning. Enforcement inside Craig's organization tightened, emphasizing accountability through prevention instead of reaction. Sloppy behavior stopped receiving second chances since tolerance invited exposure. Craig reinforced expectations quietly, replacing conversation with structure. That approach reduced friction while increasing control. Memphis violence escalated during this period, yet the page does not need chaos to explain it. Retaliation followed patterns, staying purposeful rather than random. Disputes resolved faster, often decisively, reflecting imported enforcement norms. The city felt pressure rising without erupting publicly. Craig's phone transformed into a command center, carrying decisions across distances with precision. Calls replaced meetings, limiting exposure while maintaining oversight. Instructions flowed through layers, ensuring alignment without overcommunication. That device became the nerve linking Memphis to distant conflicts. The Beltran-Leyva split forced partners to pick sides implicitly through compliance. Craig navigated that terrain by executing expectations without commentary. Performance replaced allegiance as the measure of loyalty. That neutrality preserved access while avoiding entanglement in cartel politics. Los Zetas' reputation influenced behavior indirectly, shaping responses through fear of consequence rather than direct threat. Craig adjusted operations to avoid triggering scrutiny. Understanding unpredictability carried severe costs. That awareness sharpened decision-making across his network. Discipline replaced improvisation during critical moments. Law enforcement sensed change through increased coordination among violent incidents without identifying causes. Investigators noticed patterns aligning with larger drug flows, though connections remained abstract. Craig's insulation delayed attribution, buying time during heightened scrutiny. That delay proved essential for maintaining continuity. Within Memphis, Craig's posture shifted toward firmness without exhibition. He addressed issues swiftly, avoiding prolonged disputes that invite attention. That efficiency mirrored cartel expectations without mimicking their methods. Control stayed tight without theatrical displays. This period tested Craig's adaptability, forcing alignment with evolving standards beyond his control. He recalibrated risk constantly, weighing local decisions against international consequences. That calculus governed daily operations, shaping behavior across the network. Communication discipline intensified, limiting chatter even among trusted associates. Craig emphasized brevity and clarity, reducing misinterpretation. Those changes minimized friction during high-pressure periods. Silence became another operational asset. The war in Mexico reframed Craig's environment permanently, binding Memphis to distant conflicts through supply chains. That connection raised the stakes without announcing itself publicly. Craig adjusted quietly, understanding that survival required anticipation rather than reaction. As cartel violence reshaped expectations, Craig's organization matured further, refining processes under pressure. That refinement strengthened resilience, though it also narrowed margins for error. Each successful adaptation reinforced trust upstream. The phone calls never stopped, carrying updates that shaped movement daily. Craig managed that flow with restraint, filtering noise while acting decisively. That balance kept operations stable during volatile periods. By navigating Mexico's war without direct involvement, Craig preserved access while minimizing exposure. That outcome required constant adjustment and discipline. The conflict became Memphis's problem through logistics rather than headlines. The first killing tied directly to Craig Petties did not come from rivalry or expansion, but from an internal fracture that threatened the entire structure he had built. Antonio Allen, his older cousin, sat too close to the center of early operations to drift freely once pressure arrived. By 2002, word reached Craig that Antonio had begun cooperating with law enforcement after his own arrest problems started stacking up. That information carried weight not through emotion, but through consequence, since loose mouths collapsed networks faster than raids ever could. Trust had once moved easily between them, rooted in blood and shared opportunity, yet that trust became irrelevant once exposure entered the equation. Craig understood that betrayal, whether partial or complete, forced immediate resolution to preserve stability. Allowing uncertainty to linger invited speculation, which spread faster than facts and destabilized everyone watching. That logic pushed Craig toward a decision framed as maintenance rather than punishment. The execution of Antonio Allen functioned as containment, sending a signal that boundaries mattered more than relationships. Craig did not carry out the killing personally, since distance protected leadership while reinforcing authority. Instead, the task went to Tobias Pride, a longtime associate trusted to follow instructions without deviation. Pride ambushed Allen outside his home in April 2002, closing the chapter decisively before narratives could fracture further. That killing established precedent inside the organization, clarifying that cooperation triggered consequences without negotiation. People understood the message immediately, adjusting their behavior without requiring explanation. Fear replaced assumption, tightening discipline through awareness rather than constant reminders. Craig did not discuss the murder openly, letting silence amplify its effect across the network. After Allen's death, enforcement shifted from reactive to structured, evolving into contract killings designed to eliminate threats efficiently. Craig recognized that unpredictable violence drew attention, while targeted action preserved control. That distinction mattered, since enforcement now served strategy rather than emotion. Each decision aligned with preserving supply chains, trusting upstream and internal stability. Clarence Brody entered this phase as a functional instrument rather than a personality, valued for reliability under pressure. Known for following orders precisely, Brody handled tasks others hesitated to accept. His role emphasized execution over presence, keeping focus on outcomes instead of reputation. Craig treated him as an asset, not a confidant, maintaining distance to protect command integrity. The Lewis cousins, Clinton and Martin, fit similar roles, operating as dependable enforcers rather than decision makers. Their loyalty derived from structure rather than personal allegiance, which suited Craig's evolving management style. They executed assignments efficiently, minimizing collateral exposure. That reliability strengthened their standing while reinforcing the organization's hardened posture. The logic behind these choices centered on fear as a stabilizing force, replacing loyalty that eroded under pressure. Loyalty depended on belief, while fear relied on certainty, making it more predictable. Craig favored predictability, since consistency preserved operations across expanding territories. That approach reduced emotional volatility, keeping behavior aligned with expectations. Murders during this period were connected causally, each addressing specific threats rather than isolated incidents. When Latrell Small staged a robbery posing as law enforcement in 2004, the act endangered operational secrecy. Craig responded by assigning Brody to eliminate Small, framing the hit as deterrence rather than retaliation. Small and his companion, Kalonji Griffin, were killed execution style, closing the risk without prolonging exposure. That incident reinforced the message that interference invited swift resolution, discouraging copycat attempts. The killing also highlighted Craig's preference for efficiency, eliminating both the offender and potential witness simultaneously. While grim, the outcome aligned with operational preservation. Word traveled quickly, discouraging further impersonation schemes. Mario Stewart's murder in March 2005 followed similar logic, rooted in information control rather than personal grievance. Stewart had begun cooperating with authorities, recording conversations that threatened to expose prior killings. When initial plans to silence him stalled, Craig reassigned the task to Brody and Demetrius Fields. Stewart was killed in his garage, preventing testimony before it could materialize. That killing emphasized urgency when information lacked, reinforcing that hesitation increased risk exponentially. Craig treated informants as existential threats, prioritizing elimination over negotiation. The act hardened internal attitudes, reducing tolerance for ambiguity. Silence became currency, valued above all else. Marcus Turner's torture and murder in September 2006 marked an escalation driven by internal theft rather than cooperation. When Bobby Kraft stole hundreds of pounds of cocaine, Craig demanded answers immediately. Turner, suspected of knowing Kraft's whereabouts, became the focus of extraction efforts. Over several days, he endured interrogation across multiple locations before being killed and dumped across state lines. That incident hardened the organization visibly, crossing thresholds previously avoided. Torture introduced a level of brutality that altered internal dynamics permanently. Associates realized mistakes now carried extreme consequences, reshaping behavior through fear. Craig's willingness to authorize such measures signaled an uncompromising commitment to control. Each killing reinforced the previous message, creating a chain of enforcement that stabilized operations through intimidation. Craig did not escalate randomly, choosing actions aligned with specific threats. That selectivity maintained focus while preventing widespread chaos. Violence served a purpose rather than a spectacle. The organization responded by tightening internal checks, limiting access to sensitive information. Associates compartmentalized roles, reducing exposure to failure points. Craig encouraged discretion through structure, not speeches. Fear operated quietly, embedded within routines. Law enforcement pressure increased indirectly, tracking patterns without connecting leadership conclusively. Investigators noted clustering of violence around specific networks, yet lacked evidence linking Craig directly. His insulation strategy delayed accountability, allowing enforcement methods to persist. That delay reinforced internal confidence while raising the stakes. Mario McNeil's murder in March 2007 reflected protective logic centered on family security. After McNeil threatened Craig's mother, the response came swiftly. Martin Lewis executed the hit inside a public restaurant, demonstrating reach and resolve. That act reinforced boundaries around family, signaling that personal lines remained inviolable. Each murder served a calculated purpose, reinforcing control through example rather than repetition. Craig avoided unnecessary bloodshed, yet responded decisively when boundaries were crossed. That balance preserved order while minimizing random exposure. Associates internalized expectations, reducing the need for constant oversight. The organization hardened through these actions, evolving into a structure governed by certainty. Fear replaced negotiation, discipline replaced flexibility, and silence replaced camaraderie. Craig accepted that transformation as necessary for survival at scale. The cost of that choice rippled outward, shaping the remainder of the organization's lifespan. The theft that pushed everything past recovery did not look dramatic at first, yet it landed like a structural failure inside Craig Petties' operation. Bobby Kraft, trusted with guarding a massive quantity of cocaine, disappeared with roughly 440 pounds of product, turning inventory into a question mark overnight. That loss threatened more than money, since missing volume signaled weakness to partners upstream and instability to everyone watching closely. Craig understood immediately that allowing uncertainty to linger would invite further breaches, making response unavoidable rather than optional. Kraft's disappearance created a clock, since upstream expectations did not pause for explanations, forcing Craig to demand answers fast. Attention turned toward Marcus Turner, a mid-level associate believed to know Kraft's movements through proximity rather than loyalty. Turner did not sit at the center, yet he hovered close enough to raise suspicion when pressure arrived. Craig's decision to target Turner reflected logic focused on information extraction rather than punishment, since recovery mattered more than revenge at that stage. Turner's kidnapping unfolded quietly, avoiding public scenes that attract immediate scrutiny as multiple associates moved him between houses across Memphis. The intent stayed narrow, centered on locating Kraft and recovering product before consequences multiplied. Interrogation intensified gradually, escalating when answers failed to surface, reflecting urgency rather than cruelty for its own sake. Craig remained distant, issuing directives through intermediaries while monitoring developments remotely. Over several days, Turner endured sustained questioning, accompanied by violence that stayed methodical instead of chaotic. The restraint mattered, since chaos leads to mistakes, while control preserves options even during escalation. Those involved treated the process as transactional, focusing on extracting usable information without emotional deviation. Turner insisted repeatedly that he lacked knowledge of Kraft's whereabouts, a claim that tested patience as time slipped. Meanwhile, Kraft remained elusive, evading attempts to locate him as associates spread across state lines, searching for leads. At one point, gunfire erupted during a chase involving Kraft, confirming proximity without resolution. That failure increased pressure on Turner, since the absence of alternatives narrowed focus. The organization tightened around the interrogation, believing persistence would yield results. Eventually, consensus formed that Turner likely told the truth, leaving the operation facing loss without recovery. That realization forced Craig into a decision framed by precedent rather than emotion. Releasing Turner risked exposure, while keeping him alive invited future complications. The choice to kill him followed operational logic designed to close the breach permanently. Turner's body was transported across state lines and dumped in a drainage ditch near Olive Branch, Mississippi, stripped and discarded without ceremony. That disposal reflected cleanup rather than message sending, aiming to remove a liability quietly. The act severed loose ends, closing the immediate crisis while opening larger consequences. Craig's organization resumed movement shortly after, signaling resolution internally. The emotional fallout surfaced outside operational circles, carried by Turner's family rather than his associates. His mother later described the devastation that followed the disappearance and discovery, mourning a son taken under suspicion rather than proof. Those emotions contrasted sharply with the organization's internal framing, which reduced Turner to a variable resolved. That separation illustrated how decisions made for control erase human context entirely. For Craig, this moment marked a threshold where options narrowed irreversibly. Torture and murder escalated exposure beyond earlier enforcement, inviting scrutiny that structure alone could not deflect. The organization hardened internally, adjusting expectations around compliance and silence. Fear deepened as associates recognized that mistakes now carried terminal outcomes. Law enforcement attention sharpened after Turner's murder as patterns coalesced around escalating violence tied to specific networks. Investigators connected disappearances, shootings, and recovered bodies across jurisdictions, building narrative that pointed upward. Craig's insulation delayed direct linkage, yet the margin for error thinned significantly. Each subsequent move occurred under increased scrutiny. Internally, the organization recalibrated protocols, tightening access to information and restricting movement further. Craig emphasized compartmentalization, ensuring fewer people knew more. That approach reduced risk but increased paranoia, since trust eroded under constant threat perception. Associates adjusted their behavior accordingly, limiting communication and visibility. The Turner episode also affected relationships upstream, since large losses demand explanation regardless of resolution. Craig navigated those conversations carefully, emphasizing containment and future reliability. His ability to stabilize operations preserved access temporarily, though trust required rebuilding. That effort consumed attention previously spent expanding. For families impacted by the violence, closure never arrived neatly, lingering instead as unresolved grief compounded by fear. Turner's children lost a father, while his mother carried unanswered questions alongside confirmed loss. Those consequences existed outside Craig's calculations, though they formed part of the widening damage trail. The organization moved forward, yet harm accumulated quietly. Craig recognized that the point of no return had passed, even if immediate operations continued. Legal exposure expanded alongside moral collapse, though neither halted momentum immediately. Decisions now compound risk rather than distributing it. The structure held, yet cracks widened beneath controlled surfaces. This period reshaped Craig's posture permanently, forcing reliance on control mechanisms that narrowed flexibility. Survival depended on anticipating threats rather than absorbing mistakes. That shift consumed resources and attention, altering growth trajectories. Momentum slowed as maintenance replaced expansion. The Turner torture represented escalation that could not be undone, anchoring Craig's fate to outcomes beyond negotiation. Law enforcement would eventually trace lines back through these events, assembling narratives piece by piece. At the time, Craig focused on stabilizing the present, aware that future consequences waited patiently. The organization continued, though its trajectory bent sharply downward from that moment forward. The warning signs did not arrive with flashing lights or courtroom dates, since the first hint came years earlier through a quiet disruption that never fully matured. In 2001, a marijuana seizure tied loosely to Craig Petties surfaced, creating momentary tension that faded when charges dissolved without explanation. The case disappeared on paper, yet the disappearance itself raised questions inside Craig's thinking. Outcomes like that rarely ended clean, especially when attention already hovered nearby. Drop charges often feel like relief to people who expect resolution, though Craig treated them as delays rather than dismissals. He understood that investigations pause when evidence lags, not when interest evaporates. That understanding shifted his focus toward what might be forming quietly beyond his immediate sight. The absence of consequences did not signal safety, since silence often masks preparation. Around that same period, whispers circulated through legal channels about sealed indictments accumulating without public exposure. Craig never saw the paperwork, yet patterns surfaced through delayed interactions and shifting behavior among associates. Certain people stopped answering calls, while others suddenly moved more cautiously. Those changes suggested something gathering momentum without requiring confirmation. Craig sensed the shift through timing irregularities rather than direct contact, noticing how enforcement behavior altered subtly across jurisdictions. Traffic stops increased for peripheral figures, while surveillance patterns felt less random. Those signals rarely pointed to immediate arrest, though they indicated mapping was underway. Craig treated mapping as a precursor to action, adjusting behavior accordingly. The organization responded first through internal adjustments, limiting exposure while maintaining continuity. Craig reduced appearances further, delegating authority to trusted intermediaries who managed daily operations. That distance insulated him from incidental encounters, reducing opportunities for mistakes. Leadership moved quietly into abstraction, emphasizing planning over presence. Craig framed the situation as survival math rather than fear, weighing exposure against operational necessity. Remaining physically present increased vulnerability, while absence preserved oversight without direct risk. He understood that leadership could travel without severing control, provided communication remained disciplined. That calculation shaped the next phase decisively. The decision to leave Memphis unfolded gradually, avoiding abrupt moves that attract attention. Craig spent increasing time away, testing systems through temporary absences. Each successful period reinforced confidence that operations held steady without his physical oversight. That validation made permanent distance feel logical rather than dramatic. Remote leadership demanded tighter communication protocols, forcing clarity and brevity. Craig emphasized structured reporting, requiring updates delivered consistently without excess detail. That discipline reduced confusion while preserving responsiveness. Associates adjusted quickly, recognizing expectations aligned with stability rather than control theatrics. The organization adapted through compartmentalization, ensuring information flowed upward without spreading laterally. Craig maintained oversight through selected conduits, limiting crosstalk that creates leaks. That structure mirrored corporate hierarchies more than street crews, reflecting evolution rather than retreat. Each layer absorbed responsibility without seeing the entire picture. Law enforcement pressure continued to build quietly during this phase, marked by coordinated activity across districts. Investigators exchanged information, connecting earlier seizures, disappearances, and financial anomalies. Craig sensed consolidation through changes in enforcement tempo rather than explicit threats. The pattern suggested preparation nearing completion. Craig's departure strategy prioritized invisibility over speed, choosing routes and timing that blended into normal travel. He avoided signaling exits through asset liquidation or sudden lifestyle shifts. That restraint minimized attention while preserving flexibility. The move unfolded as an extension rather than an escape. Inside Memphis, the organization continued functioning under established routines, preserving income flow and relationships. Craig's absence reduced risk without disrupting expectations among partners. That continuity reinforced confidence upstream, preventing panic during transition. Stability mattered more than visibility during uncertain periods. Sealed indictments progressed silently, accumulating evidence through testimony, records, and intercepted communication. Craig remained unaware of specifics, yet understood that silence rarely signaled inactivity. Each month without clarity narrowed margins, increasing the incentive for caution. He responded by tightening discipline rather than withdrawing entirely. Communication channels narrowed further, favoring trusted intermediaries vetted through history rather than convenience. Craig limited new connections, prioritizing reliability over expansion. That choice slowed growth but preserved control during heightened risk. The organization shifted from building toward preservation. Craig's intuition proved critical, guiding decisions without confirmation. He trusted pattern recognition shaped by years of navigating pressure. That instinct prioritized distance as protection, allowing oversight without exposure. Leadership adapted accordingly, absorbing change without fracture. The choice to lead remotely altered internal dynamics, elevating some figures while sidelining others. Responsibility is redistributed based on reliability rather than charisma. Craig observed performance metrics closely, adjusting assignments without explanation. That method preserved authority without confrontation. Law enforcement's eventual moves remained unseen at this stage, though groundwork intensified. Craig sensed proximity through changes in external behavior, including asset freezes and questioning of peripheral associates. Those developments reinforced the belief that departure timing mattered. Distance became insulation against converging pressure. This phase lacked spectacle, unfolding through calculated restraint rather than dramatic flight. Craig maintained routines, communicated selectively, and avoided actions that drew curiosity. That discipline extended the organization's lifespan despite mounting risk. Survival depended on anticipation rather than reaction. By the time the sirens eventually arrived elsewhere, Craig already operated beyond immediate reach. His absence complicated attribution, delaying enforcement despite ongoing investigations. That outcome validated the survival math guiding his decisions. Leadership continued, though under increasing constraint. The organization settled into remote governance, balancing autonomy with oversight. Craig monitored performance through updates, intervening when deviations surfaced. That approach preserved continuity while limiting exposure. The groundwork for eventual confrontation formed quietly during this period. This stretch defined Craig's transition from presence to abstraction, shaping outcomes that followed. Decisions made without urgency proved decisive later. The sirens remained unheard publicly, though their approach felt constant internally. Craig listened carefully, moving accordingly. Craig Petties settled into Queretaro without spectacle, choosing routines that felt ordinary enough to disappear inside a city known more for order than excess. Mornings followed predictable rhythms involving quiet streets, modest meals, and limited movement that avoided attention while preserving flexibility. He selected neighborhoods that blended middle-class anonymity with access routes, avoiding areas where foreign presence raised questions. That restraint reflected discipline learned earlier, prioritizing longevity over comfort while keeping options open. Life there never resembled fantasy, since daily decisions revolved around timing, discretion, and information control rather than indulgence. Craig avoided predictable patterns, rotating errands and limiting social exposure to reduce recognition. He maintained a low profile, favoring rented properties over ownership to avoid paper trails. That approach allowed him to remain present without leaving impressions that lingered. Protection existed, though it arrived quietly through warnings rather than escorts or visible force. Local contacts passed along signals about inspections, shifts in enforcement focus, and neighborhoods drawing attention. Those alerts functioned as early warning systems, allowing Craig to adjust plans before problems surfaced. Corruption did not announce itself loudly, yet it shaped margins through access and silence. Craig never relied solely on protection, understanding that safety derived from avoidance rather than enforcement. He treated warnings as guidance rather than guarantees, moving locations when conditions shifted. That vigilance reduced dependency on any single arrangement. Independence preserved leverage during uncertain moments. Remote command defined this phase, as Craig managed Memphis through layered intermediaries, chosen for reliability over charisma. Instructions traveled through narrow channels, minimizing exposure while preserving control. He demanded clarity and brevity, reducing misinterpretation during long-distance communication. That discipline maintained alignment without requiring constant intervention. Shipments continued flowing north, coordinated through schedules that balanced consistency with unpredictability. Craig monitored quantities closely, adjusting distribution when disruptions appeared. That oversight prevented shortages and stabilized income despite increased distance. Performance metrics replaced intuition, anchoring decisions in data rather than impulse. Murders ordered from afar reflected continuation rather than escalation, serving containment rather than expansion. Craig authorized actions selectively, addressing threats that jeopardized the structure or silence. Distance insulated him from execution details, though responsibility remained clear. Each decision weighed risk against necessity, preserving stability while minimizing exposure. Family life unfolded under assumed identities, blending domestic routine with constant caution. Craig kept his children enrolled in schools using aliases, maintaining normalcy without revealing origins. Home life emphasized consistency, shielding the family from operational realities. That separation protected them while intensifying his isolation. Movement remained constant, driven by caution rather than restlessness, as Craig changed residences when patterns emerged. Each relocation reset familiarity, reducing recognition while increasing logistical strain. Packing and settling became routine tasks, draining without offering comfort. That cost accumulated quietly, shaping fatigue beneath control. Silence defined relationships during this period, limiting connections to immediate family and essential contacts. Craig avoided friendships that invite curiosity, preserving boundaries through distance. That isolation reinforced focus while eroding emotional outlets. Solitude became another operational requirement. Financial management grew more complex, balancing income flow with laundering needs across borders. Craig relied on trusted accountants and couriers, compartmentalizing knowledge to reduce exposure. Currency exchanges and transfers followed structured schedules, avoiding spikes that attract scrutiny. That discipline sustained operations without triggering alarms. Communication rhythms tightened further, favoring scheduled updates over spontaneous contact. Craig reduced call frequency, emphasizing substance over reassurance. That adjustment lowered risk while maintaining oversight. Associates adapted quickly, recognizing that efficiency mattered more than familiarity. Warnings intensified periodically, signaling shifts in enforcement priorities or cartel tensions. Craig responded by pausing movement temporarily or rerouting shipments. Those adjustments preserved continuity during volatile periods. Adaptability replaced aggression as the primary survival trait. The cost of constant vigilance surfaced through physical and mental fatigue, though Craig rarely acknowledged it outwardly. Sleep patterns fragmented, shaped by alertness rather than rest. Meals and routines adjusted around communication windows. That lifestyle taxed endurance, even as operations persisted. Despite distance, Craig remained central to decision-making, filtering information before acting. He evaluated threats carefully, avoiding overreaction that invites attention. That restraint preserved resources and reduced exposure. Control remained intact through a measured response. Family presence grounded him, offering moments of normalcy amid constraint. Craig attended school events quietly, blending in among other parents without drawing attention. Those moments reinforced the motivation to maintain distance from exposure. Protection of the family stayed paramount. Operational discipline extended into domestic spaces, separating work from home as much as possible. Craig avoided discussing operations near family, preserving psychological boundaries. That separation reduced stress within the household while increasing internal burden. Responsibility concentrated inward rather than shared. Relationships with partners upstream required maintenance through performance rather than presence. Craig delivered consistently, reinforcing trust without meetings. That reliability preserved access despite absence. Results spoke louder than proximity during this phase. Over time, the strain of constant movement and silence reshaped Craig's perspective, narrowing priorities toward preservation. Expansion lost appeal as stability became the goal. Decisions favored sustainability over growth. That shift reflected awareness of accumulating risk. Law enforcement pressure continued building quietly, though distance delayed confrontation. Craig sensed investigations progressing through subtle signals, reinforcing caution. He adjusted routines accordingly, avoiding complacency. Survival required ongoing adaptation. This period solidified Craig's transformation into a remote operator, balancing control with invisibility. Leadership persisted through structure rather than presence. That approach sustained operations longer than expected. Yet the cost mounted steadily, eroding margins for error. The 5 years in Mexico passed without spectacle, marked by routine discipline rather than drama. Craig maintained Memphis from afar, proving distance did not sever control. That achievement came at personal cost, narrowing life into function. Silence preserved operations while consuming comfort. The end arrived without spectacle since the 2008 raid in Mexico unfolded through coordination rather than chaos, catching Craig Petties inside a routine moment rather than a dramatic standoff. The Mexican federal police moved on his residence in Queretaro with precision, acting on intelligence refined through months of quiet tracking. There were no gunfights, no barricades, and no drawn-out negotiations. Only commands followed and handcuffs applied. Craig understood immediately that this moment reflected culmination rather than surprise, since preparation always ends somewhere specific. Within hours, the machinery shifted from local custody to international process, moving Craig through channels designed for speed rather than deliberation. Extradition followed quickly, bypassing prolonged detention that often invites negotiation or escape. The transfer reflected priority rather than urgency, signaling interest from authorities who already held frameworks in place. Craig crossed borders under restraint, understanding that movement now served others' timelines. Sealed proceedings began almost immediately upon arrival in the United States, shielding details from public view while shaping leverage privately. Prosecutors controlled information flow tightly, limiting exposure while structuring pressure behind closed doors. That secrecy mattered, since public narratives complicate negotiation while silence preserves flexibility. Craig entered this phase aware that visibility no longer offered an advantage. Leverage surfaced quickly through family immigration status, introducing stakes beyond personal consequence. Authorities referenced residency vulnerabilities tied to relatives, framing cooperation as protection rather than confession. That tactic carried weight, since Craig prioritized family security even while accepting personal outcomes. The calculus shifted from self-preservation toward minimizing collateral damage. Cooperation followed as a transaction rather than surrender, bounded by terms that preserved limited control. Craig provided information selectively, focusing on confirming known structures rather than inventing narratives. That approach reduced exposure while offering value aligned with prosecutors' objectives. Each exchange remained measured, avoiding excess that invites reinterpretation. Refusal of witness protection reflected Craig's assessment of long-term viability rather than bravado. He understood relocation offered limited safety once cooperation surfaced publicly. Remaining within the system preserved predictability, even if conditions remained harsh. That choice aligned with his preference for controlled outcomes over uncertain alternatives. The assistance Craig provided confirmed connections, routes, and roles already partially mapped by investigators. His input filled gaps rather than building cases from scratch, accelerating prosecutions without redefining scope. That contribution mattered, though it lacked the transformative impact that would reshape sentencing entirely. Value remained finite, constrained by timing and completeness. Prosecutors evaluated cooperation through utilitarian lenses, measuring usefulness against severity. Craig's crimes spanned multiple murders, trafficking, and international conspiracy, stacking weight beyond mitigation reach. Even helpful testimony could not erase scale, since guidelines limit discretion once thresholds pass. Assistance influenced the process rather than the outcome. Sealed deals unfolded quietly, avoiding courtroom theatrics while shaping plea frameworks. Craig accepted responsibility strategically, acknowledging facts that aligned with evidence. That alignment shortened proceedings without altering endpoint severity. Efficiency replaced contest during this stage. Family considerations remained central throughout negotiation, guiding Craig's boundaries. He declined opportunities that offered expanded exposure for marginal benefit. Protecting relatives took precedence over marginal sentence reductions unlikely to materialize. That prioritization anchored decisions amid pressure. Investigators pursued additional arrests using corroborated details Craig provided, validating cooperation without public acknowledgement. Those outcomes reinforced transactional value while maintaining confidentiality. Craig observed effects indirectly, aware that usefulness extended beyond personal benefit. Cooperation served institutional goals rather than personal redemption. Refusal of broader protection programs also reflected the assessment of credibility among inmates. Craig calculated that visibility from cooperation would follow regardless of relocation. Remaining transparent within the system reduced unpredictability. That realism shaped acceptance rather than resistance. Sentencing calculations progressed independent of cooperation narratives, driven by statutory requirements. Enhancements compounded, reflecting leadership role, violence, and international scope. Craig recognized that assistance could not dismantle mandatory frameworks already triggered. Expectations adjusted accordingly. Courtroom appearances remained restrained, focused on procedure rather than persuasion. Arguments emphasized record rather than rhetoric. Craig listened more than spoke, understanding that influence waned as the process advanced. The outcome approached steadily, without deviation. Why help failed to translate into mercy rested in structure rather than sentiment. The system values cooperation, yet punishes severity decisively. Craig's actions crossed thresholds beyond negotiation, anchoring outcomes firmly. Assistance softened edges without moving foundations. Family immigration matters resolved quietly, reflecting negotiated outcomes separate from sentencing headlines. That resolution validated Craig's priorities, even as personal consequences remained severe. Protecting the family achieved tangible results amid otherwise fixed trajectories. That trade defined the transaction's purpose. Public perception lagged behind reality, speculating about leniency that never arrived. Rumors circulated regarding deals and protection, missing nuance embedded in sealed proceedings. Craig anticipated that confusion, recognizing the distance between perception and process. Silence preserved accuracy where explanation would not. Refusal to dramatize cooperation preserved dignity while limiting misinterpretation. Craig avoided public statements, letting records speak privately. That restraint reduced backlash while maintaining order within the system. Communication remained minimal by design. The path towards sentencing narrowed as options closed, guided by frameworks already activated. Cooperation concluded as a phase rather than a salvation. Craig accepted that assistance influenced contours, not destination. The endpoint remained unchanged. The sentencing hearing made sense only after everything that came before, since the judge's words finally carried weight beyond confusion. Prosecutors laid out murders, trafficking routes, torture evidence, leadership enhancements, then stacked penalties until 9 life sentences settled like concrete. Victim statements followed, spoken by mothers, sisters, children, each voice steady while recounting absences that never corrected themselves. Defense arguments barely shifted anything, since statutory floors locked outcomes long before emotion entered the room. What sounded impossible at the beginning now aligned with scale, even if nobody felt relief afterward. Craig Petties disappeared into the federal system quietly, housed far from Memphis, moving through concrete routine stripped of influence or audience. His days narrowed into counts, meals, brief recreation windows, limited calls, everything structured to erase leverage permanently. Isolation replaced command, since communication no longer shaped outcomes beyond immediate survival. The man who once coordinated cities now existed inside schedules decided by others. That transition carried no spectacle, only removal from motion that once defined him. Outside prison walls, narratives fractured immediately, especially across Memphis blocks that remember different versions of the same name. Some called him a mastermind who overreached. Others labeled him reckless, while rumors of cooperation floated without agreement. Street memory rarely follows court transcripts, favoring fragments shaped by loyalty or resentment. Younger hustlers spoke his name cautiously, treating it like a warning rather than a blueprint. Beyond Memphis, his story circulated as a case study, stripped of neighborhood texture entirely. What stayed behind was not closure, since nothing closed cleanly when violence stretched across years and borders. Families carried losses forward, investigators archived files, and streets absorbed lessons without announcing them. The opening confusion returned, though it felt clearer now, since 9 life sentences reflected accumulation rather than surprise. Nothing balanced out, nothing redeemed itself, nothing wrapped neatly. The road only made sense once walked backward, even while the ending refused to explain itself.